The double stroke roll is one of the fundamental techniques that we find in virtually all of drumming. It is prominent on the snare drum and it is prominent on the drum set as well, and we find it in virtually every drumming tradition. It is perhaps most prominent in the North American rudimental tradition and also the Swiss and French rudimental traditions, and variations of the double strokes occur in British military drumming, Scottish pipe drumming, and to a lesser extent orchestral drumming as well. As I say, the concept of a double stroke roll is slightly different depending on the tradition and the cultures surrounding that, but some variation, some form of double strokes occur in virtually all areas of drumming. It poses a problem technique-wise because it can be very difficult to play a very good double stroke roll, and there are philosophical problems as well as to what actually makes a good technique and if such a thing as perfect technique exists. So today I'm going to discuss a little bit about technique itself, some of my thoughts on technique, and an exploration of how technique applies to the double stroke roll specifically. I want to begin by saying that I am very, very firmly against any form of dogmatism when it comes to technique. I think we need to be very, very wary of any authoritative sources that claim to have the single best way of doing everything. I've been very, very fortunate in my career so far that I've been able to study firsthand with some of the world's best drummers. I've been very, very fortunate to have some phenomenal teachers and some phenomenal opportunities to study with some great drummers. And it never ceases to amaze me how different they all are in their approach to doing things. Doesn't matter who it is, when they have shown me their particular take on, let's say, a double stroke roll, it has always been different to the way everybody else has shown me. So that says to me, there are multiple ways to achieve what we're trying to achieve. If you watch 50 drummers play a double stroke roll, you will see 50 different types of double stroke roll. This all comes from a position of individuality because we are different physically and mentally. So the length of our fingers, the size of our palm, the way our thumbs sit, our wrists, the way we move, and crucially, the way we conceptualize and the way we think about movement is as individual to us as our bodies are. So trying to tell a student that there is one way of doing it, we hold the sticks in exactly this position, neglects to accommodate for this individuality. So I believe the best approach and the most success I have had has come from this is when we adopt this attitude of exploration and we try and learn from as many different sources as we can, even if they conflict with each other, and we take the best bits and see how they apply to us. So the way I play a double stroke roll is essentially unique to me. Yours is going to look unique to you. Just like any drummer you can think of, it's going to be specific to them. I'm never going to make my hands look like somebody else's because I can't. My hands are unique to me. Likewise, I can't make my double stroke roll look exactly the same as somebody else's. So far more important is this concept of understanding the fundamental elements of a technique and then having the confidence and the knowledge to apply that to our own playing. When we have a firm understanding of how a technique works and how it helps us achieve what we're trying to achieve, the physical aspect becomes pretty much trivial, simple. It doesn't become easy. The physical aspect requires a lot of hard work, a lot of dedication, a lot of time, a lot of repetition, and a lot of focus. But it's simple. It's trivial. When you repeat something properly, you become very, 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 very good at doing that thing. But this needs to be prefaced by a correct understanding. Now, when I say a correct understanding, that's in the context of everything I've just said, not correct as in the correct way to do it, but a thorough understanding so you are confident in the way you are practicing. So what I want to talk about today are some fundamental elements of grip and technique, and then look at how they specifically apply to the double stroke roll. I'm going to break it down into essentially three fundamental elements as to the grip and how the hands interact with the stick. And hopefully in better understanding these principal elements, we can better understand our technique, better understand the double stroke roll, and have more success in practicing the double stroke roll. The first, and the perhaps most important element of our grip, of our technique, whether it's double strokes or anything else, is in the fulcrum. And funnily enough, this is perhaps the most divisive and controversial element of the grips. We have all experienced confusion as to where that fulcrum should be, whether it should be on the index finger towards the tip or towards the knuckle, whether it should be on the middle finger towards the tip or towards the knuckle. Maybe it's some kind of combination of both of those fingers. If we play French timpani grip, the the fulcrum is underneath the hand. If we play some form of matched grip, the fulcrum is on either side of the stick. If we play some kind of traditional grip, where is the fulcrum? Kind of sitting underneath the thumb here. And we all know and can think of teachers and perhaps world-renowned drummers who have very strong opinions either way about where that fulcrum should be. Because there are so many different ways that we can do it, and there are drummers out there who do it in all of these ways, the one takeaway from this is that it doesn't really matter where the fulcrum is. What matters is that we understand the function of the fulcrum. If we understand the function of the fulcrum, we can apply it to our own grip and make sure we're getting the most out of it, regardless of which finger we're using. Personally, I seem to favour a front fulcrum on the index finger, but that's just what's most suitable for me. If you find that you're using your middle finger, as long as you can make it work for you, that's absolutely fine, because that's most comfortable for your own approach. Now, a fulcrum, in very basic terms, is a pivot point. If we take a simple system like a seesaw, we have a fulcrum underneath and essentially a plank on top. And if we apply weight on one end, the other end raises into the air. And this is the principle of a seesaw. Now the fulcrum point is right here in the middle, around which and over which the seesaw pivots. A second type of fulcrum that we can consider, which is a slightly different version, might be a bicycle wheel rotating around a central axle. Now if we imagine a bicycle wheel rotating this way, there is a central pivot point that is not held from beneath, like in the case of a seesaw, but it's held on an axle and pinned on either side by the frame of the bike, and that bicycle wheel rotates around this central part. Now, if we consider a drumstick, depending on where our grip is, which kind of grip we use, that fulcrum is either going to be underneath, like in the case of French timpani grip, or that grip is going to be side to side, like in the case of a bicycle, and we find this in more traditional matched grip. We can see the stick is being held side to side. Likewise, in traditional grip, that fulcrum point is underneath the stick in French timpani grip, and on either side of the stick in more conventional matched grip. The whole point is that the stick has a fulcrum. That's all that really matters. The stick needs a fulcrum point around which it rotates. If we're playing in a sort of French grip here, we can see that stick going up and down over this fulcrum which is beneath the stick. Likewise, we can see the stick rotating here. Likewise, in traditional, just removing everything, we can see the stick rotating over that pivot point. As I've said, it doesn't really matter where that fulcrum point is, so long as we have one. Now, there are arguments for a front finger fulcrum, and there are arguments for a middle finger fulcrum. I'm not going to get into either of those. I've experienced both, I've explored both, I've learned both, and I've been taught both. And for me, it's most comfortable at the front of the hand on the bottom crease of the index finger. But as I've said, that's individual to me. This element of the grip is perhaps the most crucial. That serves to hold the stick in position and provide a static fulcrum point for the stick to rotate within. Without that, we're not going to get a clean stroke. Moving up to the next element of the grip, we come to the fingers. And the role of the fingers, specifically these back three fingers, is to engage and create the stroke. Now, if we want to experience what this feels like, we can hold the stick at the top like this and use the fingertips of these back three fingers to pull the stick into our arm. Now, even though there is a very slight movement on the wrist, there's no actual engagement in the wrist here. All of this motion is coming from these fingers opening and closing. All I'm essentially doing is this. We put the stick in position and we see something that starts to look like a drum stroke. If we take that drumstick to where we normally hold it and repeat the same action, we can see the fingers engaging, the fulcrum staying stationary, and the stick pivoting within that fulcrum. We take that down to the drum, and we have a very simple stroke, and we're just using our fingers to sustain this bouncing stick, like bouncing a basketball low to the ground. We're employing this finger engagement to send the stick down to the drum over that pivot point, over that fulcrum. Moving up again, I've already hinted at the use of the wrist. The role of the wrist is to inject energy and momentum into our strokes. If I try and play solely with the fingers, I'm very limited in the power I can generate. So if I start using my wrists, I can generate more power into the stroke, and I can inject more energy into the movement of the stick. Now, what we need is for all three elements of this grip to work together to generate the stroke. We need the fulcrum to stay strong and provide the pivot point. We need the fingers to engage to create the stroke and control the movement of the stick. And we need the rotation of the wrist to inject energy into that stroke. First of all, to actually achieve a double stroke, we need these fingers to engage twice. The whole essence of a double stroke is to play twice per hand and have them all evenly articulated. And the crucial aspect here is I'm in control of all of those strokes regardless of how fast I'm playing. These are not buzz strokes where there is an indeterminate number of buzzes per stroke. I'm in control no matter how fast I get. There are exactly 2 strokes per hand, and I'm using my fingers to control those. The fulcrum is static, the fingers engage twice. Now, if we consider this exercise again, we can sort of get an idea for this by simply practicing a double stroke roll using just our fingers. And even though there is a little bit of wrist movement backwards and forwards, that wrist is not engaging. This is all coming from the fingers. However, we need the wrist to engage to actually generate enough energy for the stick to rebound. So if we start nice and slowly, you can see a combination of wrist movements, and crucially, if I do it from the side, my fingers are engaging twice per stroke. You can see them opening and closing. Now, as I start to speed up, we'll start to see more rebound in the stick. Those fingers are still controlling everything. And you can see I'm generating the stroke and I'm generating the rhythm from the wrist, but it's the fingers that are creating the doubles. Now, as I get smaller and faster, the fingers are doing more of the work, and then eventually I need my arms to take over because the wrists have reached their limit. So if we start to consider each element of the grip as gears in a car, we've kind of got low gears, middle gears, and then high gears on the forearms themselves. The forearms and the wrists inject energy into the stroke, held in position and controlled by the fulcrum, and engaged by the fingers. And all of these need to work together to create the double. Now, one way we can do this is to place double strokes within a single stroke roll. And what we will see is that the wrist motion doesn't change. You can see I'm playing a single stroke roll here from the wrists. Now, there is a little bit of a finger snap to generate the snap on each stroke, but this is all a wrist motion. Now, what I'm going to do is introduce a double stroke on every third stroke, and you'll see it's just the engagement of the fingers There aren't 2 wrist movements, there's 1 wrist movement. That double stroke is being created by the fingers closing twice within that wrist movement. So if I transition between single strokes and then double strokes, you will see that the larger wrist motions remain the same. Hopefully you can see from the wrist perspective, there's very little difference between playing single strokes and double strokes. What's happening here is the engagement of those fingers. So as I was saying, this exercise where we play a double stroke on every third single is a really effective way to start isolating those doubles. One way we can do to increase the emphasis here is to apply a molar-esque whip, a tenuto, over the double stroke itself, articulating both strokes and applying a subtle emphasis. By incorporating the forearms into the whip, It's forcing my fulcrum to remain strong, and it's forcing my fingers to engage cleanly. One thing you may be able to see here is the stick movement within my hand. I see a lot of students who hold the sticks very closed. The sticks are pulled into their hands, and they try to produce a double stroke, powering through from the wrists. Very difficult to do, and it sounds appalling, and you can see there's no movement in the hand. That stick needs to be free to move within the hand. So this exercise is a nice starting point, and then we can advance onto 2 consecutive double strokes followed by a single stroke. That's a really good way to test your control, and really again forces you to engage your fingers in a very controlled manner, because we don't want to diddle that 3rd stroke. Finally, the double stroke roll itself is simply an alternation of these strokes. Now again, going back to the wrist, it feels largely the same as playing a single stroke roll at half the rate. The wrist motion is the same, and now I can use my fingers to generate the doubles within that. Watch my wrists, the motion is the same. And that's the essence of the double stroke roll. Now, one of the things I want to touch on is this concept of a drop catch. This is a motion that allows you to essentially get 2 strokes for the price of 1, and it looks like this. And maybe you can see there's a downwards motion where the hand opens and the stick moves upwards, and then there's an upwards motion where the hand closes and the stick creates a second stroke. Notice the hand opens at the bottom and closes at the top. We generally call this a drop catch or a drop clasp, and it's a way to produce doubles. Now, that's not necessarily how it feels to actually play a double stroke roll, but to practice this movement will again develop your sense of isolation and your ability to control what those fingers are doing and how the stick moves in the hand. Now, the hardest part watching my own students, the hardest part people have is that first stage, catching the stick at the top. The closing part is easy. So what we need to do is use a wrist stroke to go down to the drum to provide the first stroke. We've allowed the stick to rebound, the fingers have stayed open, and the thumb is holding it in position against those fingers. See, the stick is up, ready for a second stroke, but the hand is down. We close the hand and the stick creates a second stroke. Now again, that's not necessarily how we will play the double stroke roll itself. It feels a little bit awkward, but as I've said, it's a great way to build up your sense of isolation and your conscious control over those fingers. As we start to resume normal speed, I'm not emphasizing that motion anymore, but I'm still using some sense of a drop catch, a clinch, double closing of those fingers within the one wrist motion. And this is the same sort of approach when we play a drag. There's one wrist motion, but 2 finger motions to create that double. If I do that very slowly, the wrist moves down, but the fingers close to create a second stroke. Now, all of this stems from understanding. As I've said, it would be a very different video if I carried on down this route and got into more and more smaller details about how to actually hold the stick and manipulate them and the creases of the fingers and the angles of the sticks and all of that stuff. And that's not my intention here. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that your success with double strokes is going to come from having an intimate understanding of how the sticks interact with the hands and how the hands interact with the sticks. It's a system, and you need to be in control of that system. And to gain control of that system comes from study, it comes from practicing, it comes from time and familiarity. And ultimately, from a technical standpoint, the one criterion that matters is whether or not the technique works. And for me, I have found an approach that works. And hopefully through this video, I've shared with you a few things that you can think about to apply to your own approach that will help you as well. One thing I'd like to close with is more of a practical point. I have spent a long time in the past practicing double strokes like this. For as long as I can bear it, to a metronome for a long period of time. And that is important up to a point. A out of context double stroke roll, what we call a long roll, is an important part of our learning process, but it is very, very rare that the rudiment as a musical idea occurs in this position, occurs in this way. So perhaps one of the most effective ways you can actually develop your own double stroke roll is to learn repertoire which contains double stroke rolls. If you take someone like John Pratt, his extensive rudimental repertoire is absolutely full of rudimental double stroke rolls. 5 strokes, 7 strokes, 9s, 11s, 15s and everything else, and they occur as part of a musical figure. And if you are learning those figures, you're learning these pieces the way they are supposed to be played, following all the instructions of the notation, paying attention to the dynamics and the rhythms and the speeds and the accents, you will develop a double stroke roll by necessity. And this is something I've been learning and experiencing more and more myself. If I want to learn something technique-wise, I will seek it out in the repertoire and learn the piece that contains it. Because then not only am I increasing my technical ability with it, but I'm actually learning musical application. I'm learning context. Technique doesn't exist in a vacuum, so we shouldn't practice it in a vacuum. There is a place for just an open roll, a long roll. But we can conceive of a drummer who can do that very fast, very loud, very clean for a very long period of time, and they still wouldn't be able to play some of the snare drum solos that we know and love, because that's not how it's employed. That's not how it's applied. So yes, practice your open long roll for as long as you like, but also consider tackling some of the repertoire that contains double strokes and allow that to inform your technique. It's important that we learn to understand the differences in application and not just consider the double stroke roll or indeed any technique on which we are working in a vacuum. Treat it in the context it's meant, and I think you will have a great deal of success that way. When you have multiple different teachers telling you different things, learn all of them and seek to understand all of them. And you might actually find when you strip away the differences in vocabulary and teaching styles and dogmatism, they're actually all discussing the same thing, but just using different terms. The fundamental principles are the same. We need a strong fulcrum. We need the fingers to engage. We need the wrist to inject power and energy into the stroke. We need forearms if we want to go even faster and inject more energy, like moving up through the gears on a bicycle. When we understand these things, whether you're using French, German, American, traditional and different degrees of traditional, it doesn't really matter because the principles are the same. We're using our knowledge to control a stick to hit a drum.